everyone. So next up, we have Greg DePrisco from MakerDAO, who's going to be talking about the Maker improvement proposals.
Hi, everyone. My name is Greg DePrisco, and I'm the head of business development at the Maker Foundation. The Maker Foundation is the centralized entity that produces the software that powers the DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization called MakerDAO. And the MakerDAO is the creator of the DAI stablecoin. It is the decentralized governance layer that's behind the creation and destruction of DAI, which is the preeminent stablecoin on Ethereum. In the system, there's three components that you should know about. There's DAI, which is just a cryptocurrency that's soft pegged to the US dollar. So if you hold it, it should always be worth $1. And it also has a nice feature called the DAI savings rate that I'll talk about in a second. There are vaults, and this is how DAI is generated. These are people who want to take out loans. They don't want to have stability. They just want to borrow DAI so they could go get liquidity in fiat currency or buy more volatile assets for leverage. And then finally, there's the maker holders. And they're actually going to be the core of my presentation today because I want to talk about decentralized governance. But just to give you a brief history of where we've been and where we are, Maker was founded about 5 years ago. It was one of the earliest Ethereum projects. It originally set out to just create a simple dollar-backed stablecoin, but that ended up being a much broader vision because it turns out that it's very complicated to create dollars on a blockchain. We released single collateral DAI, which was the beta version of our system 2 years ago, and that was recently shut down. But that was where you could generate DAI against the cryptocurrency Ether, and it was only backed by Ether. It wasn't a very scalable system. So now we've launched multi-collateral DAI. And multi-collateral DAI, in theory, lets you generate DAI against any asset that you can imagine. All it's needed is this decentralized governance process to onboard and price those assets in a way that allows DAI to be generated safely. So in that context, today I want to talk about maker improvement proposals. And I'm going to take you on what I call the tour des MIPS, because that is the core of the governance framework that we've put in place. So if you'll just give me a second, I'm going to share my screen. The tour des MIPS, or maker improvement proposals. It's a walkthrough of the MakerDAO governance framework and how anybody can propose new collateral. So what's the big deal? Well, if Maker didn't have a decentralized governance framework that scales, we'd really be no better than our centralized competitors. We may as well just be people sitting in a boardroom, signing papers and shaking hands. But if you think about the real promise of blockchains, they let us coordinate in ways that we couldn't coordinate before. And the hope is that the output of this coordination is a product that's better than what we have in the legacy economy. So maker improvement proposals provide an objective framework for that coordination. And most importantly, they provide the structure by which others can then build further structure into the protocol. So let's talk about MIP1 and MIP2. These are the foundational improvement proposals. And within them, you have the blueprint to build all of the other improvement proposals. So the first one is called Maker Governance Paradigms. This MIP defines what we refer to as a problem space. It sets out what MIPs in general are supposed to do, and it also provides a blueprint for what's needed for decentralized governance in general. So to give you some examples of what's in MIP1, it talks about having to have oracles, but it also talks about things about compensating server farms to have support front ends and making sure that you have marketing in a decentralized organization. So MIP1 really shows the total roadmap to decentralization. But it needs to be taken in the context of MIP2. Because if we just put those things out there as this blueprint and we didn't provide a way to actually create them, we'd end up in this constant purgatory of conversation. So MIP2 gives people the ability to fast track the things that are in the list on MIP1. And forgive me, I know this is sort of complicated. These are the more philosophical MIPs. But they're the most important as well, because they're the bedrock of everything else that's going to get built. And they really outline what you can do with the structure and what you can't do with the structure. I don't want to go too into detail about these because they do get very in-depth. If you want to read about any MIP in general, just go to forum.makerdao.com and they're all there in the Maker Improvement Proposals section. But just going back to this, the MIP2 will let you fast track any MIP that's referenced in MIP1. And the fast track process is just proposing the MIP and then going through a maker vote. MIP3 outlines a governance cycle. Now, this seems mundane, but without this, you don't know when to coordinate. And without knowing when to coordinate, you have a real fragment of that coordination. So this is to be differentiated from our weekly governance cycle. The weekly governance cycle is to determine the flexible rates in the system, such as stability fees, DAI savings rate, etc. Oh, and I know I promised I'd talk about that earlier. The DAI savings rate is just a way for the maker holders to pass some of their income onto DAI holders. It's why DAI has the highest interest rate of any stablecoin out there. But the MIP3 governance cycle outlines when MIPs can be discussed. So some people may disagree with this. I know our founder, Rune, likes to talk about how different fragments of the maker holders like to participate in different things. I feel like the weekly cycle is left to the real experts that are in the weeds, looking at the data and trying to figure out the best parameters for that week. And, most maker holders trust them to do that, and they won't participate unless there's something controversial. But the monthly governance cycle, which is what's outlined in MIP3, is where you vote on these structural changes to the protocol. And it's where you vote in other MIPs, you vote in Collateral, you vote in oracles. And this is where I think a lot more maker holders want to participate, because it really has long-term implications for their future. MIP 4 and 5, they show you how to make changes to the core process and how to deal with emergencies. So MIP 4 is how you can differentiate between what needs to be an amendment or how to remove something from an existing MIP versus what needs to be a new MIP. And this is, again, very important, because if you have people trying to insert amendments into MIPs where they don't fit, then you've basically have a sort of governance creep or corruption where you don't know what's going to end up in them. So MIP 4 outlines very objectively what needs to be in a MIP and what shouldn't be in that specific MIP, and when you need to create a new one. And MIP 5 is how to get around all of this, because sometimes there's emergencies and you need to be flexible and deal with them. But what MIP 5 does is it defines an emergency and tells you when it's acceptable to have an emergency vote and when you can consider the process corrupted because you're voting on things that should be voted through in the normal monthly governance structure out of that structure. And in general, that would represent corruption of the governance process. And if the maker holders are on board with it, just a nullification of this process in general. We hope that doesn't happen. MIP 6 is where things get very interesting. So MIP 6 is the collateral onboarding forum. This is where anybody can come to the forums and propose new types of collateral. And I think we must have at least 20 in there right now. And we're actually going through our first green light poll, which I'll talk about in a minute. But MIP 6 is where if you are an asset issuer, if you are any sort of borrower, or even just a community member that wants to see a new type of collateral entered into the protocol. And just as a reminder, when collateral is in the protocol, it means you're allowed to generate DAI against it at the parameters that the maker holders set. So MIP 7 is the onboarding and offboarding of domain teams. Now, domain teams are a new concept I'm introducing to you here. So let me just give a quick description of what they are. Domain teams, in theory, are experts. So you have financial risk analysis experts, you have legal experts, you have technical experts, you have Oracle experts. And these experts are supposed to function as teams that eventually get paid as elected paid contributors. And they are the teams that will use MIP 8, which I'll show you in a second. But onboarding and offboarding, all this is doing is the maker holders, when they vote on a MIP 7 subproposal, are identifying a specific forum name. And that forum name now has special status. And this is more of a social contract than anything else, because that special status doesn't actually let them do anything technically to the protocol. The maker holders ultimately have the final say. And sometimes it can. I shouldn't say that objectively, but in general, they are making recommendations to the protocol. And that special status allows them to have weight on those recommendations. And the core thing that domain teams do is the domain greenlight. So the greenlight is very much a social contract. And this is where a domain team will say, yes, this collateral has what it needs to enter the protocol from my perspective. So for example, if you are doing a financial risk analysis on the invoices, you might say, I have enough information to give this a preliminary green light and say that, while I don't know what the risk parameters will be yet, I think this can enter the protocol. Smart contracts, same thing. They have enough audits. It seems fine. There's no huge red flags. I think it's okay. And when they do this, it's not binding. It's just a signal to the maker holders that for when they do a MIP9, which is a community green light. Now, the community green light is to signal back to the domain teams and to the entire community, and for that matter, the order that they want collateral entered. So if I submit my invoice application this month and the maker holders really like it, but they like 2 other collateral types better than mine, then it'll be 3rd. But if they like 9 other collateral types better than me, then it'll be the 10th in priority. And the domain teams don't necessarily have to listen to this priority as they go to onboard the collateral. But if they don't, they're probably going to get voted out eventually. This is the social contract that exists between the domain teams and the community, and its interplay is defined by MIP8 and MIP9 through domain greenlights and community greenlights, where generally there should be a connection there. But if there's a massive disconnect, those domain teams are just going to get voted out because the community and the maker token holders are ultimately the ones who have the final say. MIP10 is Oracle management. Now, oracles to a decentralized protocol are always the most risky thing that you have going for you. It's just inevitable. If you can control the price, you can control the protocol. So this has its own MIP where if you want to alter the software of the Oracle, so even if the Oracle domain team is given its green light and the asset has all the other things that it needs to enter the protocol, you still need to submit a MIP10 sub-proposal in order to actually affect those changes to the Oracle software. So I look at this like an extra layer of security and just really good practice to document all sorts of software updates to the Oracle software. MIP11 and MIP12 are the ones that you'll probably see the most of, even though they are the final ones on the list. So MIP11 is where you onboard risk models. Now, a risk model is different from risk parameters, and they both need to be approved. So when I say a risk model, it means taking raw data about a collateral type and outputting risk parameters. So not only do the risk parameters, which is what's covered in MIP12, and by the way, risk parameters are things like the stability fee that should be associated with the asset, the volatility, the liquidity, those are actually in the model, but the debt ceiling, which is how much DAI that can get generated against that asset, the collateralization ratio, that's probably the most important one. That's where your liquidation ratio is where you'll get liquidated if your collateral value goes below that rate. And the modeling that's used to output those parameters needs to be approved for any model that you use. So if I propose my invoices and we only have models for digital bearer assets on Ethereum, like ERC20 tokens, then you can't onboard my invoices because they need to have an invoice model that's used, or at least a model that these invoices can fit in to be used to enter into the protocol. And then once you have a model, you can output those things as a MIP12 sub-proposal and submit the specific risk parameters for that specific asset. And when this is done, the collateral is actually in the system, and now users can deposit into the vaults and generate DAI against it. Just to show you the tangible benefits of this, governance is working. We've now onboarded 2 new types of collateral. They were onboarded through the emergency procedures because we had DAI sitting above the peg, but it's still a big milestone because when we launched multi-collateral DAI, there was really this vacuum of activity where nobody knew how to kickstart the process. And with USDC entering the protocol, the process was kickstarted, And now we have a trend towards adding new collateral every time we need it. So the two collateral types that we entered were USDC and WBTC. And within, I think it was a week or two of entering WBTC, we had 10 million DAI or 9 million DAI generated against it almost instantly. So this is the chart of the DAI and SAI supply over time from inception. As you can see, it started out at 0 in 2017. It had a nice run up into 2019, and then the market crashed and it sat still. But now we experience huge growth up until March when everything crashed again. But what I think is the most important part of this chart is this final line, because this shows the efficacy of the governance process and the new collateral that we've onboarded. This is much faster growth than we've seen before, and rebounding out of just such a heinous crash like this. I'm really optimistic about the future, and I'm very excited to see this governance process continue to unfold. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I think there's going to be a question portion to this presentation, so I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
But yeah, so it looks like starting off with a question in the chat. We got one surrounded Black Thursday, obviously a monumental event in crypto and in DeFi in particular. So I guess we got one user asking how is Maker planning on moving forward after that, I guess.
Yeah, well, March, that was one of those things where it fortunately didn't kill us, and because it didn't kill us, it made us a lot stronger. And even within 48 hours of those initial events, we saw immediate changes coming from the governance community. And what was really important about this is that prior to that moment, the governance was pretty slow. We launched in November. We didn't onboard any new collateral. We didn't see too many new proposals come to place. It was a very slow process, and then it just exploded and kickstarted with those events. So we made it through. They changed auction parameters. The auction parameters went from 10 minutes to 6 hours. They added USDC within 48 hours. And now, a month later, they added WBTC. So I think you've already seen the change. The change is that this social consensus layer has hardened, and now it's starting to act more efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is rather impressive, the speed at which the governance cycles kind of picked up with Maker.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting. I think that's the most exciting thing going on right now.
Absolutely. And so having lurked in the governance chats now for better part of the last year, something I've been curious, especially like recently, you kind of touched on at the end there, but MIP 14, the ability to transfer DAI outside the protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that has a lot of implications for the sustainability as a whole, right? Being able to incentivize various actions. So I'm curious, how do you see, if that's implemented, how that could be used going forward?
Well, I think the main thing that's for, and I could be wrong about this because there's already so many MIPs that it's confusing, but I'm pretty sure the goal is to do elected paid contributors. So this will really be the first time that a decentralized organization starts hiring proper contractors without using a normal corporate structure. And the way they do that is through mechanisms like MIP 14, which actually outlines the technical process by which you can identify a problem, set out a solution, set out a payment for that solution, and then run through the machinations to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be super interesting to watch going forward. Is get to see full scale DAO in action.
Yeah, it's gonna be cool.
So yeah, another one. So the MIP 6 is obviously, there've been a lot of proposals there for collateral types, and we've already seen a handful of, I quote, like trusted assets with USDC and WBTC. I'm curious, are there any that like haven't been proposed that you guys would be excited to have join, or like anything kind of cool that people aren't talking about? I mean, I know there was the like tokenized T-bills that Fluidity kind of put out the proposal last summer. Mm-hmm. Anything along those lines?
So I'm actually going to twist your question a bit, because my take is that there should be no asset that's rejected, rather than assets that I'm excited about. I'm excited about every asset. The role of the maker holder, from my perspective, is to price risk. And if they do that accurately, there should be no asset they're not willing to let generate DAI against. It's just a matter of figuring out the right parameters.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Looks like we got another one. So what is your take on some of the proposals for, I guess, these new crypto collateralized stablecoins?
Look, I love experimentation in the space, and anything that achieves a relative amount of stability and has natural demand will make great collateral for DAI. And I don't know if they're going to have product market fit. That's a whole different argument. But if they do pull it off and they get some users, then I'd love to welcome them in as collateral to MakerDAO.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, looks like we're at that ending point here. Thank you so much again for joining us.
My pleasure.